Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority's InNoVAtion Lunch and Learn series. I'm so glad to see you here. My name is Mackenzie Love, and I'm the lead of NVTA's Transportation Technology Committee, and I'll be your host and moderator today. This series was designed to create opportunities for pragmatic information exchange on technologies and innovations that are feasible either immediately or in the near future, say 1 to 5 years. And each of the series focuses on topics supported by our Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, or TTSP, as we like to refer to it. The TTSP was designed to proactively prepare for emerging technologies and innovations by maximizing the benefits and minimizing any potential negatives that might come from their implementation. The 8 strategies and action plans that initially comprised the TTSP were adopted by the authority in May of 2021, and the first substantive updates were made in November of 2022. This included the expansion of the scope of 2 existing strategies and the addition of 1 new strategy. Today's topic of effective standardization, collection, and use of bike ped data is relevant to several of the 9 strategies, most notably number 1, which is to reduce congestion and increase throughput, and number 7, which is to enhance regional coordination and encourage interoperability in the transportation system. But before we get into that very exciting topic, I have just a few housekeeping notes that I would like to share with you. The first is that we ask you to keep your microphones on mute for the duration of the presentation, but please know that we will offer an opportunity to ask questions verbally later on in the presentation. In the meantime, we invite you to put any questions that you may have in the chat box, and I will be monitoring those and sharing them with our speakers at the question and answer session after their presentations today. Finally, if you experience any technical difficulties at all, please put those in the chat box as well, and my colleague Ian Newman is online and he will be able to assist you. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Ralph Buehler, Professor and Chair of the Urban Affairs and Planning Program at Virginia Tech Research Center. Dr. Steve Hankey, Associate Professor of Urban Affairs and Planning at Virginia Tech. Dani Moore, Research Technician at the University of North Carolina and Highway Safety Research Center. And Heidi Mitter, the Bicycle, Pedestrian, and Park and Ride Coordinator for the Virginia Department of Transportation, NOVA District. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Buehler.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting us. Thank you very much for attending this Lunch and Learn. I have the great pleasure to talk with Steve and Dani about data for pedestrian and bicycle planning. Next slide, please. Specifically, I'll first talk about typical data sources that are used for planning for pedestrians and cyclists. Steve will then focus on count data, and Dani will give a specific example on counting pedestrians and cyclists on DC area national trails. And then in the end, we'll try to answer your questions together. Next slide, please. This slide lists a couple of typical data sources used for planning for walking and cycling. First, there are travel surveys. Then we have data from the US Census Bureau. We also have new data from apps like Strava, for example. We also have data from bike share systems or scooter share systems that are created by those systems. And then we have data from counters. These can be manual counts or it can be automated counts. One item that's not listed here, and some communities use that as a rough guide on where walking and cycling are going, are participation or attendance records. For example, there's Bike to Work Day tomorrow, and communities keep track on how many people stopped at their pit stops over time to sort of get a rough sense of where things are going. Next slide, please. Here are some more details on these typical data that we have for walking and cycling. One is household travel surveys. These are typically define a geography and then randomly select the participants. Participants are sent a travel diary to keep track of their travel during a specific day or sometimes even entire week. Travel surveys provide detailed information about trips, trip purpose, time of day, destinations, also detailed information about trip makers and their entire households. Also, we get data, as I said before, over entire days, sometimes entire weeks. As a drawback, these surveys are expensive. they're time consuming, and there are big time gaps typically between the surveys. In the DC area here, we have a regional household travel survey, and it's done every 5 to 10 years. So it's a long wait to get the update. The content of the surveys and the survey methodology can also vary over time, casting doubt over comparability. And if we want to study typical walking and cycling facilities or small geographic areas, these surveys are typically not representative for that. There are other types of surveys, like ad hoc surveys on attitudes and preferences. We often see those in pedestrian and bicycle master plans. When these plans are developed, there's a survey element. And of course, we also have intercept surveys at certain pedestrian or cycling facilities, but they are typically not representative. Another data source that's often used is US Census Bureau data. These are standardized data from the Census or the American Community Survey. We can use 5-year average data to even get at smaller geographies using that data. A big drawback, of course, is that they only capture the typical main mode of travel to work. For example, if you walk every day to public transport and ride public transport to work, walking will not be recorded there. On top of that, of course, we know that the commute only accounts for less than 20% of all trips. And this varies by geography, what the exact share is of commute trips among all trips. Even though we can go down to smaller geographies, we still get large errors in estimates for these smaller geographies, especially if we look at walking and cycling data, because it's still quite rare. And we have limited information about trip makers and their households, or at least only at the aggregate level. Next slide, please. App-based data are new. They are continuous. There's a continuous data source. They are, for example, from apps like Strava, where you download the app and you have a fitness tracker or something on your phone, on your watch, or you have a wristband that tracks you. The data are continuous. There is also, where's my cell phone here? There are also, this cell phone is collecting data all the time on you, and it's sold to companies that are aggregating it and use it for planning for transportation, companies like Streetlight. These data are typically quite precise for geography and for time of day, but we typically don't get any information about the trip maker or the trip purpose, why people are traveling. Studies have shown there is selection bias. People who download the Strava app, for example, are more likely to go out jogging and cycling for fitness, but there's also bias in the other apps, and we need some ground truth to anchor this new app-based data. The next item here are bike share, scooter share system data. So whenever you check out a bike or a scooter, or check in a bike or a scooter, data are recorded. Sometimes they're even recording your entire trip. Some of the data are publicly shared. Sometimes the companies keep it for themselves, but it's used for planning for bicycling. The question, however, is how much is it correlated with cycling, and to what extent is it not correlated with bicycling? We get good data by time of day and by location. However, that location depends on, of course, where the docking stations are, if it's a docked system, or where the operational area is, because we won't get data outside of the operational area. We typically have no information about trip makers or trip purposes in that. And then last, we have the count data. There's a tradition in many jurisdictions on manual counts, often by volunteers at bridges or at certain spots where many pedestrians or cyclists are, often at certain times of the year, one specific day of the year over time. More recently, we have many more automated counters that can provide year-round data at specific locations. With that data, we get the time of day, sometimes the directionality of travel, but the location choice where these counters are put up or where the manual counters are sent to make a big difference. And we typically don't have data on the trip makers or the trip purpose. And now I'm turning it over to my colleague Steve, who will talk in much more detail about count data.
Thanks, Ralph. Yeah, so this is my role here is just to give a kind of brief refresher on counts and sort of why they're important and how they might be used. And then I'll of course turn it over to Dani and Heidi to talk more about the sort of nitty-gritty details of how to actually keep these counters up and running and select sites and all those sorts of fun things. But the main thing I wanted to point out today, and I'll sort of just do this in a few slides, is that there are many ways that I think collecting counts can align with what DOTs are already doing with motor vehicles, how counts are being collected and sort of the databases are being built and these sorts of things. So, just as a refresher, of course, traffic counts in general, whether or not they're bicycles, pedestrians, motor vehicles, are a pretty important part or important component of the transport planning engineering process. There's a long history, of course, for motor vehicles of calculating things like performance measures from these, around annual average daily traffic, AADT, for example, or VMT, vehicle miles traveled, sort of these, sort of long-standing metrics that are tracked over time. And of course, those performance measures are then used to either lobby for or, sort of make decisions around funding and project selection and these sorts of things. So these traffic counts, have historically been a pretty important thing. The problem with bicycles and pedestrians, of course, is, we're getting better at this, but especially say 10 years ago, bicycles and pedestrians just weren't really a part of this process. They weren't being counted, weren't able to sort of then, build into this process of calculating these performance measures, kind of get into the funding discussions, these sorts of things. And so, of course, if we do a better job of counting bicycles and pedestrians, then, the opposite of this happens. It's the basis for, arguing for funding, evaluating projects when we do install them. It can give us better exposure metrics around, things like safety and hazards, say crashes, for example, moving from crash numbers and maps of where crashes are happening to crash rates and these sorts of things. So, so that's sort of the goal here. Next slide, please. So just briefly, what can we learn from motor vehicles? Obviously, motor vehicles have been counted for, many, many decades now. This is a long-standing process. And, I guess today what I'm going to show right after this is just a quick example from the trail network in Minneapolis. But the sort of short summary is that basically, I think we can do something very similar with minor modifications for bicycles and pedestrians. So that, the framework of this of these motor vehicle databases, kind of count protocols, these sorts of things maybe need to be tweaked a little bit, but not reinvented. And so, the sort of general idea here is, I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but the general idea is that you have a reference network of counters up, where you have these, counters that are up for long periods of time, over, seasons, years, these reference networks that are up and running and for a long time. And the idea with this is to be able to track seasonal, temporal patterns, develop something called a scaling factor, in order to then be able to go out for short durations at other sites in the motor vehicle world. That's 48 hours, and collect a short duration count at locations, use that reference network then to scale it up to one of these performance measures, AADT or VMT or something like this. And so what I'll just kind of show, with this example from Minneapolis is that I think, and other, researchers have documented this as well. We did it in Minneapolis, but, that there's just sort of minor modifications that are probably needed for bikes and pedestrians, but the same basic framework applies of these sort of reference counters and short duration counters. Maybe we need to tweak some things, like instead of doing a 48-hour short duration count, we need to move that to 1 week instead to kind of get a reasonable approximation. We might develop these scaling factors a little bit different than what is the tradition for motor vehicles, but a similar concept. And that enables us to then calculate these same performance measures. Next slide, please. So here's just, I'm going to just do this in 2 slides for Minneapolis. This was done about 10, 12 years ago or so now. So it's, this was sort of, back when Minneapolis was primarily using manual counts, to go out and sort of count bicycles and pedestrians. There were 6 counters up on the trail system, and so we had done, a little bit of work there just to say, okay, if we were to kind of move to automated counts, at all these locations, how would we do that? How would we develop these scaling factors? How would we sort of recommend how long a short duration count should be, these sorts of things. And so what's shown on the left here is just from these 6 counters, from a year's worth of counts, the sort of traditional scaling approach. It's to, take what's called a day of week factor. So when you went out and did your short duration count, what day of week was it? As well as a month of year factor. So these kind of 2 scaling factors. Use those then to take your short duration count, whatever it is, 2, 3, 4, 5 days or whatever, and scale that up to an annual average or an AADT or something like that. We, at the time, we presented this at TRB about 10 or 12 years ago. And interestingly, in the same session, people from Montreal and a few other places sort of, did a similar result, presented a similar result. But because bike and ped traffic is a little more variable, we, decided to developed something called a day of year factor, which is just slightly different. This is just sort of taking a ratio for every day of the year. So there's 365 factors rather than this sort of day a week and month of year, but based on the similar type of data. So we kind of have this new scaling approach, which is just a slight modification. Next slide, please. We then looked at sort of the traditional method. So what's being shown on this plot is the absolute error, the mean absolute error of estimating AADT from a short duration count on sort of the y-axis here. And then on the x-axis is the number of days that you go out and do a short duration count. So kind of starting at like, if you just go out for one day, and then up to, almost a month worth of short duration counts. And you have sort of the traditional scaling method, this month of year, day of week in the dotted black line, and then the solid red line is this day of year scaling factor. But the takeaway here is with a slightly different scaling method. And then if you look at sort of the knee of the curve here, at about 7 days, sort of a slightly longer short duration count, you're getting to about 10% error in this AADT estimation, which is, pretty good, a pretty reasonable estimate. So this is sort of just to sort of say that, yes, I think, counting, with sort of a robust counting network, it's very possible to sort of mimic or sort of adjust from what the core motor vehicle framework count framework is. We might need to make small sort of tweaks to this, but it would really, I think, having sort of this in place would really sort of allow for inclusion of this bike ped data to really be assimilated into all these databases that are ongoing and really sort of the hope would be, at least in my mind, put this on par with other projects that are being proposed for other modes of transportation. So sort of working into this framework. So one more quick slide before I hand it off to Dani and Heidi, who will give us more details on the actual how you actually do this and all the problems that come up with actually keeping the counters up and everything. Of course, the technology is evolving. This is just some counters we've worked with in the past, just pictures of these. As I kind of mentioned, and Ralph did, if you looked at this 15 years ago, I mean, manual counts for 2 hours once a season or something would be like the dominant, thing. People would just be going out with a clipboard and sort of counting, and of course, these technologies have been, evolving over the last 10 or 15 years quite a bit to where, it's much easier to sort of put these out there, and sort of get reliable information over time. It's still not just, still not seamless. Of course, Dani and Heidi will sort of show this in a second here, that there's still work to be done to maintain them and those sorts of things, of course, but getting this information is certainly a lot easier, than it was before. And so, so with that, I'll pass it off to Dani to actually give us, some details on what's happening in the region and some examples of this.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm Dani, and I have been working with Steve and Ralph in the broader context. We can go to the next slide. Of a research project called the National Capital Regional Trail Monitoring and Analysis Program. It is being conducted by the University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center, Virginia Tech, and Portland State University, with funding from the National Park Service and DDOT. And the ultimate goal of this project is to create a comprehensive picture of trail use in and around DC. We can go to the next slide. So the project is kind of broken down into 5 task areas. One of them is facilitating coordination among the various jurisdictions in the DC area. The second one is actually doing the maintenance on the counters, so validating the counters, maintaining them, and providing recommendations for sites for new counters. We're also creating a shared regional database and public dashboard so that anybody who was interested in bike and pedestrian traffic in the DC region can come and get data from all the different jurisdictions compiled in one place. We're also doing some analysis and reporting, and also looking at using those big data sets that Ralph mentioned at the beginning, like Strava and other big data to figure out how we can measure trail traffic. I'm responsible for task number 2. So you can go ahead to the next slide. This is the one we're going to focus on today. So validating counters, maintaining existing counters, and citing new counters. We can go ahead to the next slide. So I'm assuming that we are here in this Zoom meeting because we are interested in getting bike and pedestrian data in order to make good decisions from that data, planning decisions, safety decisions. And so I want to stress that bad data is going to lead to bad decisions. And so today I'm going to talk briefly about 2 things that are in service of avoiding bad data. So in other words, things you can do to get good data. And so I'm going to be sharing some best practices for citing and installing counters, and then stress the importance of validating counters. So we can go ahead to the next slide. All right, so I've got 5 pieces of advice on citing new counters. The first one is pretty intuitive, which is choose your location strategically. So for example, if you are interested in measuring traffic on the Woodrow Wilson Memorial Bridge, you would want to put your counter in a place where it's going to capture everybody who's crossing the bridge and not at some point after when some folks have split off. So pretty intuitive. We'll move on to my second piece of advice. The second one is to test for possible sources of interference before installing. And of course, that's going to depend on what kind of counter system you're installing. If you're looking at eco counters, you'll be testing for electromagnetic interference and also interference with the device that is an infrared detector that will be measuring the number of pedestrians going by. So make sure that you don't have any sources of interference in the environment before you commit to anything in the ground. Next slide. The next piece of advice that we can give is that you want to communicate your installation instructions pretty exactingly to your contractors, and ideally you can be on site during installation. There's a lot of small nuances in terms of how these systems go in, and a lot of contractors don't have experience with them. And so just being there, I think one particular thing that we've run into multiple times is being very clear as to which side of the trail the counter should go on is something that needs to be explicitly stated. We can go to number 4. It is good practice to have your contractors perform a mini validation after installation just to make sure that everything is working as it should be after installation. We've prepared a 2-page worksheet that contractors can fill out. So if that's something we're happy to share if people are interested, but just a good way to make sure that the folks who are installing the counter are not walking away until you're sure that the counter is doing what it should be. And advice number 5, and my next slide, is to work with someone with experience if you can. So this picture shows my supervisor, Krista Nordback, talking to the National Park Service about where to site some counters on the beach drive in Rock Creek Park. I know Heidi's going to be speaking in a moment about her experience, and just taking advantage of the well-earned knowledge of people in the region, I think is very worthwhile. I'll also mention David Patton from Arlington as somebody who has a lot of experience with these counters. So here are my 5 pieces of advice on citing new counters. And with that, I'm going to move ahead to the second goal here, which is the importance of validating counters. So let me tell you a little bit about what that means. Basically, validating a counter is comparing counter data to data from a human observer. And that can be done in real time, like me sitting in the field with a clipboard and comparing it to the counter in real time. Or you can use recorded video data and then look at the counter outputs, the counter data. So in any case, you're looking at the real world data and making sure that it matches the counter data. Go ahead. So there's one big reason why to validate, and that is to make sure that the counter is counting accurately as you need it to be and to troubleshoot if necessary. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So just to bring up one example of a case study, this is the Rose Park Trail at P Street in Washington, D.C. And through validation, the graduate students at Virginia Tech determined that the infrared sensor, which is intended to pick up pedestrians, was also picking up the movement of cars on P Street. And there's no reason that you would have thought this is the case just by looking at the data from the counter. It just looked like fine, numbers. It looked like fine numbers. Nothing about it looked suspicious. But it was only when we actually compared the number of people walking past the counter to the numbers that the counter was generating that the students at Virginia Tech were able to say, hey, these numbers are way off. And again, it came down to which side of the trail the counter was installed in. And so that goes back to being really thoughtful about your planning where the counter should go and very detailed in communicating with your contractors as to how to install it. And I think I've got one more slide here. So this is the data that was coming from that counter. It's the pink line at the top of the graph. And the other lines represent other counters that are on the same trail network. And just to illustrate the point that if you hadn't done the validation and you were just running with this data from the counter and trusting it without the validation, you might draw all kinds of wrong conclusions. You might say like, wow, this trail is really getting way more traffic than the rest of the trail system. And then, inappropriately devote more resources to that particular trail. Or you might notice like, hey, the counts are really high on Fridays at this particular site. But again, that seems to be driven more by the error of picking up the cars on P Street than the actual flow of pedestrians past the counter. And so from the bad data, you could draw bad decisions, which would be a misappropriation of taxpayer money. And so I think we can go ahead to the final slide here, which is just to illustrate my takeaways for you, is that in order to get useful data from your trail counting program, you want to be really thoughtful about your installation and siting of counters, because that's very hard to reverse once it's done, if it's done inappropriately the first time. And that it is worthwhile to validate your counters after installation and periodically thereafter. And with that, I can turn it over to Heidi, who's going to share some lessons learned from eco counters.
Wow, thank you, Dani. That was really helpful for what I'm going to say. Hi, everyone. Heidi Mitter, the VDOT District Bike, Ped, and Park and Ride Coordinator. I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the things I've learned so far from installing eco counter devices through our Transform 66 project. And I'm by no means an expert like our previous speakers. So this is kind of aimed at, fellow planners and localities that may want to find themselves in similar shoes as I did. Next slide, please. So what kind of counters am I going to be talking about? So the Transform 66 project is a public-private partnership, and we had technical requirements as part of the project that specified there were to be 8 bicycle and pedestrian counters that had to fit a certain description that our contractors had to procure and install. So the description that was planned out and put into that contract was, counting bikes and peds, had to be have the capability to do automatic data transmission and things that could fit with this type of product here. So we can see that the Eco Counter brand, Urban Multi, which is a brand name, is bikes and peds, and the urban style is the steel housing, which has a logger, sensors, and battery inside, and has that automatic data transmission capability. So there's the passive infrared sensor called the brand name Pyro, and the inductive loop called Zelt, or Zelt. Next slide, please. So some of the things I have learned is that if your project, your transportation project, is going to have counters as part of the project, if it's a design build project where a contract is signed early on in the project phase, you need to plan well ahead and get the counters into that contract. So the description of what kind of counter you want needs to be done early on. Check your agency procurement rules. The Eco Counter company is a foreign company that can cause some complications possibly. And if you really want a certain brand or a certain kind of counter like these Eco Counters, it can be a sole source product or proprietary product that has implications during procurement. Like Dani advised, talk to other planners in the region, other experts, including the company like Eco Counter's customer service in advance. That can be really helpful in identifying exactly what kind of products or system you should have, and advice on installing and siting them. Ask yourself, do you really want a permanent counter, or would portable temporary counters also fit your needs? I've heard that temporary counters can also be quite durable and maybe a bit more versatile if you put them for 1 month in a certain place, move them around a little bit month by month. The urban style of eco counters is advised. This is the steel housing versus their rural style, which has a wood post and some elements that are more exposed. In VDOT's experience, those can be more of a maintenance challenge to have the rural exposed kind. Ask around for product manuals. The product manuals give a lot of insight into the different components and installation tips. Like Dani said, understand the counter positioning and location do's and don'ts. I think Dani covered a lot of those things, but you don't want to have cars in the background, moving trees in the background, electrical interference, don't want to have drainage issues, things like that. And very importantly, from the outset, have a plan and a budget for ongoing maintenance needs, who is going to do it, the physical maintenance in the field, as well as taking care of the data, monitoring, validating, displaying it on a public dashboard, etc. And coordinate with the installation contractors, and do some of that testing, make sure that the data is transmitting, as well as counting bicyclists and pedestrians correctly, or whichever modes you are intending to count. Next slide, please. This is an overview of the locations of the 8 eco counters on the 66 parallel trail. On the left, we have Route 28, so the 28 interchange with I-66. And then on the far right, we have Gallows Road near the Dunloring Metro Station. So it was specified years ago to have 8 counters. So I tried to space them out, as best as possible across the approximately 11 miles of the corridor. So we do have some that are near metro stations, park and ride lot, and interchanges. Next slide, please. So our project has installed 4 of the 8 eco counters thus far, more on the eastern half of the corridor. These are pictures from the installation, which occurred a few weeks ago. They do generally cut the asphalt, lay the wires down, put epoxy over it. You can see inside the counters, there's battery, different sensors, and then the holes on the right is where the sensors look out and count the people. We will be installing the other 4 counters more in the western half of the corridor in the coming weeks and months as the construction finishes up on the shared use path this summer. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. This is a screenshot of the VDOT Eco Counter statewide dashboard. These are not all permanent counters. VDOT does have several temporary counters that are deployed through our central office across the state to do temporary counts. And we've also linked in a lot of the Arlington permanent counters. So my next task is to learn about and complete the, link up of our brand new counters with our statewide dashboard, and do the data validation. And I will add that we are going to be working with COG TPB staff to help us with the data validation and maintenance through an ongoing technical assistance program and data collection program we have with them. That should be it, I believe. Next slide. Yep, that's it. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you all for this wonderful expertise that you shared with us and the updates on the projects. This is very great information to have. And we'd like to open it up for a few questions. And I'd encourage everyone who's attending to put your questions in that meeting chat box. Or if you'd like to ask something verbally, click the small hand icon at the bottom of your screen to raise your virtual hand. We did get a couple of questions in advance, so I will start with those. But actually, first, I'd like to take a bit of host prerogative and ask you all a question quickly. I know we only have about 10 minutes left, but could any of you speak to any other types of data that synergize really well with these bike ped counts, and what kind of insights you can get from putting those 2 types of data together, 2 or more types of data together?
There is, I'll start off and others may have other thoughts. There is promise in, but we're still exploring that, in connecting the counter data as the ground truth to streetlight data or to Strava data. There are also already initial studies. Some of them point to bias. We have to see how we can overcome that bias, especially in the Strava or in the app data. But that would sort of be a neat feature if we could use the ground truth from the counters and then link it to the app-based data that's generated.
I'll add that VDOT District does perform 24-hour counts, again with our COG TPB Technical Assistance Program across the NOVA region. So I don't know if it will synergize. I don't know exactly how it's going to synergize, but you know, I think we're able to get more of a variety, of course, in the 24-hour counts done by InNoVAtion cameras, get more geographic diversity, and hopefully, you know, be able to draw some comparisons.
Thank you, Dr. Buehler and Heidi. I'd also like to move forward with the online questions before we move to those in the chat box. First, Josh Schult of the City of Alexandria asked if there's a best book to read on this topic, and I have a feeling you all might have some wonderful recommendations on that.
You know, I don't know if the question is about counts in general, you know, or sort of counters or counts. You know, I don't know if there's a book out there on that I'm thinking of, but there are a number of NCHRP reports, you know, that are, you know, kind of deal with, you know, if it's really kind of digging into the counter performance and those sorts of things. Those are kind of the, you know, the big efforts that I know of that, you know, there were people collaborating on these sorts of topics, you know, I guess. So, of course, Ralph and others have books on cycling in general, you know, I guess, but for the count related stuff, that's what comes to mind for me. And I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but certainly we could send those around or something also.
Great. And if you think of any reports, you could send them to me and I can get them out to folks. So thank you for that, Dr. Hankey. We also had a question from Chris Bass, who is a member of NBC's Transportation Technology Committee. What role can e-bike rebates play in driving adoptions? And are there any data that show the efficacy of, or that represent e-bikes in your counts, or show the efficacy of using them as a reduction tool in comparing them to VMT?
I don't know about the rebate question. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that, but there's, you know, the other question that's in the chat is about video counters also, you know, I guess. And so, you know, one thing that Dani hinted at, and that, you know, I guess just to be more explicit with it, the way we're doing it in the region now is we actually have these cameras out at every counter when we validate them. And so they record the trail traffic for 3 days or so, you know, so we kind of have 3 days of video footage at the counter. And then the students who are then doing the data reduction on that, not only are counting how many bikes and pedestrians walk by each counter for validation, but they're also trying to do their best to flag a bunch of this stuff. Like, you know, was there something like a side-by-side, you know, passing where the counter might not pick that up? So there's kind of like behavioral things they're trying to pick up, but also things like, was it an e-bike? Was it a, you know, conventional bike? Was it a scooter? Was there a vehicle that drove down the road? Was there, you know, a wheelchair or a rollerblader or whatever? So they're kind of trying to flag all that stuff. And so I think one thing that's, you know, if it's possible, one thing that's nice about having that video footage is then you always have it, you know. And so, you know, we did our best to kind of develop a spreadsheet to kind of flag all these things as we were going through it. But, you know, of course, we probably missed something, you know, somewhere along the line. So having that, you know, that recording in perpetuity is kind of a nice thing to have, I think.
Yes, in terms of the rebate programs, they seem to be quite successful in getting people to buy e-bikes and ride them. The examples here in the US, but also in Europe, like Paris and Munich, they have been doing that for much longer time, and many of them have now sort of also switched to the cargo e-bikes. Several of the programs are income based. So once you have an income above a certain level, you're sort of not eligible for them anymore. We see a lot of e-bike uptake in general. The US is sort of behind. Many European countries are leading in that, and they're sort of switching now from initially many older adults who were switching to e-bikes, and now more and more people are moving that way. There was a study from Oxford University recently. They looked at the CO2 emissions for different types of transportation, and bicycling and e-bikes were both in there. And I'm not sure, but I think they may have had something about VMT replacement as well. Other than that, I'm not that familiar with clear studies that show a replacement e-bike to car trips, but my guess is it's much more likely than for normal bike trips, because e-bikes can go longer distances. E-bikes allow you to have more things you want to carry, and they attract people who would otherwise have chosen a different mode of transport.
Thank you for that information and resources. We have another question here from Bill Cutler of VDOT. Are we behind or ahead of other large metropolitan regions in regards to bike ped counting? And is there anything to learn from similar regions who may be ahead of us?
I don't know. That's a hard one to answer. I'd say, like, I don't know if I would put anywhere ahead or behind on some of this stuff. I think it just looks, my own perspective, it looks a lot different everywhere. So certainly I think there's things to learn from the way everybody is doing it. But, I think and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody else who wants to jump in on this, but I think of sort of some of the early movers on at least like the count programs, not necessarily like infrastructure and these sorts of things, but, actually putting in counters were North Carolina, Minnesota, Colorado, and Oregon. I think we're all pretty like early on in sort of at least kind of trying to get a program up and running. And they all looked really different. I think who was leading those efforts and how that was going. And so I think some of it was like at the state level, the DOT doing it. Some of it was like a, metropolitan region kind of leading it. Within that, region, it could have been different entities that were kind of pushing, advocacy groups or the, local government or whatever, and so, I don't know. I mean, the only thing that I, notice, I guess, from that is in each of those cases, there was sort of like a pretty clear, champion, of a person who really kind of wanted all of it to happen, and so, I don't know. So that seems important, at least, to have sort of, a person or two really kind of, advocating and pushing for that, I guess. But yeah, but I wouldn't put the region or Virginia in general behind or ahead on any of this. I think it's kind of like everybody's kind of trying to figure it out and what the best way is to do it. And it looks a little bit different everywhere, I think.
Great. Thank you for addressing that, Dr. Hankey. A couple of other questions that have come up. Let's see. Dani and Heidi, you both mentioned some opportunities, some projects that are ongoing, the National Capital Trail Monitoring and Analysis Program. And Heidi, you touched on the statewide bicycle and pedestrian count network. Are there opportunities for entities that install counters, either permanent or temporary, to participate in those platforms? And if so, could you kind of talk through the first steps of how people get involved in that?
Sure. So I will say that the project that I'm working on with the University of North Carolina, Virginia Tech, the National Park Service, and Portland State University is very much interested in at least communication with regional partners. So anybody who is in the greater DC area who wants to participate in the conversations, there's all levels of participation. You can just kind of be on an observer and listening, or you can give us funding and become like actually like very centrally involved in the project. That entire spectrum exists. And the person that I would reach out to is Krista Nordback at the Highway Safety Research Center in University of North Carolina. And I will drop her email in the chat.
So for VDOT's Eco Counter statewide dashboard, if you have an Eco Counter, you can absolutely participate in our map. It just requires linking each counter into the map, as far as I know. And for our, we have another map for Northern Virginia with the 24-hour counts. That actually also can display eco counter counts. It's a slightly different format, but as far as other brands of counters, I'm not sure it would require a fair amount of staff work to take data and upload it to our map. So we typically don't display other brands or formats on our maps, but eco counters are definitely easiest.
Great. Thank you for that. We are running out of time here, but I know that there's one more question in the chat box. So if you would like to stay on and listen to the last question, if our speakers would bear with me for a couple more minutes, I'll go over that. And then we'll close out in just a couple of minutes. So briefly, Maria Vida asks, do you have any experience you might be able to share related to forecasting and modeling bike ped needs? And I'll address that to the whole group.
I guess, Maria, if you don't mind, what do you mean by needs in the sense? Is that like like anticipated traffic volumes in areas or prioritizing infrastructure, or what? Yeah, what is the particular need of interest? Justify infrastructure.
That it in the chat box to justify infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know. I mean, the experience, my group has with this, and of course, there's other ways to go about this, is, developing some sort of statistical model. So if you have these counts and you have enough of them in a region, you could, generate a statistical model to extrapolate that to the network, to the full network, and look at volumes and that sort of thing, and look at the impact, of, say, bike lanes, trails, whatever, kind of within that statistical model. And I think, just to tie this back, I mean, this is kind of speculation, but, tie this back to what Ralph had mentioned earlier, as far as the data fusion question that you had, Mackenzie, around sort of maybe the app-based, data and counts and things. And I think one thing that people are interested in is, yeah, we know that there are these biases in the app-based data, and we know, but they also offer this sort of rich, spatial information also. And so, it seems likely that those two pieces of information can really be merged, in that sort of framework where you'd have sort of some, model to then project volumes for the whole network or something, of course, with any statistical model, it's like projecting into the future is sort of do it at your own risk, I suppose, but I think it at least gives you insight into, what the impact in that region is of a, bike lane or not, given sort of like the average, average street or something like that. It also would, give you some basis to say, hey, here's the volumes we kind of expect to see, across the network, or something, based on sort of this, this ground truth of the counts. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question or not, but that's, sort of the approach at least we've taken with that.
But I would also caution and take into account the conditions on the trail network and on the roadways. So combining any demand data you have with something like level of traffic stress or something on the network, because just because you don't have anybody cycling there doesn't mean that there's no demand. It's just too dangerous to ride there. Like yesterday afternoon, I live in Alexandria. I wanted to ride to REI, which is 8 miles away. And I mapped it out and said, oh, it maps out nicely. And then I did Google Street View, and there were sharrows, but it was on 4-lane roadways with 35-mile-per-hour traffic, and I'm just not going to ride there. So just because we don't have cyclists there doesn't mean that nobody wants to ride there. I would have ridden there if there would have been safe infrastructure. So we shouldn't forget that when it comes to cycling. The same is true actually also for pedestrians. Just because we don't see people crossing the street there doesn't mean that there's not demand. It just means that it's unsafe to do so.
Thank you all for your answers here. And Ian, if you could put back up the slides for just a moment, we'll go ahead and close out today's session and move to the next slide. I wanted to say thank you again to all of our wonderful speakers, Dr. Buehler, Dr. Hankey, Dani Moore, and Heidi Mitter. Thank you all for your expertise and for the updates. To everyone who's in attendance, please keep an eye on your email. We'll be sending you a survey to get some feedback about this session. And we'll also, in the near future, be sending out invitations to our next Lunch and Learn, which is anticipated in the middle of June. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for
Mackenzie.
attending.
Thank you. Bye
Yeah,
bye.
thanks.